Hello, and welcome to Session 3 of the Christian Foundations of Our Deepest Values. In this session, we will examine the foundations of liberty, freedom, and consent. Tell me, Heron, are you free? Can you tell me where your freedom comes from? Are you a free bird? What's the source of your freedom? Hello, Mr. Owl. Are you free? Where does your freedom come from? Can you tell me, Mr. Owl, are you free? Where does that freedom come from? Does it come from your wings? Our freedom and our liberty are precious to us. But where do these values come from? Have all cultures in all times and places similarly enjoyed such freedom? Or is the type of freedom and liberty that we enjoy unique to a particular cultural context and historical tradition? Did the American Revolution or French Enlightenment invent liberty? If not, where did this revolutionary value come from? The ancient world had no concept or notion of the ideas of freedom and liberty that we take for granted and enjoy today. The concepts of free citizens or of political freedoms or liberties were completely unknown to the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and India. While on the individual and social levels there was indeed a distinction between being free and being a slave, freedom still meant being integrated in and obedient to the given order in pretty much a constant state of agricultural or military servitude. Only a tiny minority of women and men had any personal or political freedom in these ancient civilizations. Only the queens and kings had a voice or a choice. In these early civilizations, only those men and women who were at the top of the proverbial pyramid had a vote. Thus, 2,950 years before the Common Era, only one woman, Queen and Pharaoh Merenyth, had the vote in Egypt, and only one man, King Etana, had the vote in Mesopotamia. What about freedom of speech? Where does that value come from? And where does the idea of freedom of thought or religion first emerge? Again, we find no such concepts of these freedoms in any ancient civilizations in China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Americas, or even in ancient Greece. While some have attempted to argue that Cicero and the Stoics before him had developed notions of universal human dignity and universal human freedom, a closer look reveals that this is not quite the case, as historian Kyle Harper explains. As the death of Socrates clearly shows us, even in the democratic city-state of ancient Athens, there was no recognition of freedom of thought or speech as any kind of basic human right. Our modern notions of freedom have their beginnings in the early Christian church. Oxford University historian and political philosopher Sir Larry Zeidentop examines the roots of belief in individual freedom and liberty in his book, Inventing the Individual. Zeidentop shows how our modern conceptions of freedom and liberty can ultimately be traced back to the Apostle Paul. Paul's understanding of the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection introduced to the world a new picture of reality. It provided an ontological foundation for the individual through the promise that humans have access to the deepest reality as individuals, rather than merely as members of a category or a group. For Paul, liberty and freedom is open to all humans as individuals. Freedom of action is understood as a gift of grace from God. Another book that takes an in-depth look at the historical roots of the values of freedom and liberty that we take so much for granted today is Christianity and Freedom, edited by Timothy Shaw and Alan Hertzke. The scholars in this book show how various doctrines of Christian theology and anthropology have sown seeds of freedom and liberty throughout a number of historical and cultural contexts. And such seeds of freedom and liberty were without precedent or parallel. The fruit of these seeds is the liberty, freedom, and democracy that much of the world enjoys today. The first person on record who explicitly conceptualizes the concepts of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and religious liberty was the early church father, Tertullian. Tertullian articulates a robust concept of liberty and freedom in the context of persecution. How did the radical ideas of religious freedom in the early Christian church come to exercise such a powerful influence on imperial Rome? A central figure in explaining how Christian ideas of freedom took root among the ruling authorities of the Roman Empire was Lactantius, a prominent theologian and orator who articulated his plea for universal liberty in the context of the Emperor Diocletian's great persecution of the early 300s. Lactantius pleaded with the pagan persecutors of the church, arguing that true justice and piety demanded a policy of tolerance and freedom for all believers, including Christians. When Constantine converted to Christianity, Lactantius succeeded in persuading him that religious repression was antithetical to government under Christian law. While the policies of the previous emperors aimed to force conformity through violence, Lactantius contended that political authorities could and should achieve authentic religious conformity only through voluntary conversion to religious truth. And this idea would become one of the foundation stones of Western political thought regarding freedom and democracy. The early Christian church's distinctive values and principles contributed not just to the development of religious liberty, but to a new and unprecedented concept of political freedom, which included the revolutionary notions of limited government and an independent civil society not subject to the authority of the state. Scholar Larry Ziedentop, in his book Inventing the Individual, shows how the concept of freedom and liberty in the early church was passed down to the Christian Middle Ages. In this book, Ziedentop shows that the roots of political liberty, belief in individual freedom, in the fundamental moral equality of individuals, in a legal system based on equality, and in a representative form of government befitting a society of free people, were all pioneered by Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages who drew on the moral revolution carried out by the early church. These Christian philosophers, church canon lawyers, and early church fathers not Renaissance humanists or Enlightenment revolutionaries laid the foundation for freedom-based liberal democracy in the West. Renaissance and Enlightenment views on human rights, liberty, and freedom were built on the bedrock of human dignity that is inconceivable without Christianity. In the ancient world, sexual relations and slavery were manifestations of the proverbial pyramid of power, where those men and women at the top could use those at the bottom however they desired or saw fit. Today, it is difficult for us to imagine the values and moral systems that these ancient cultures rested on. In ancient China, Egypt, Rome, and India, for example, there was absolutely no conception of the equal worth of human beings, and there was no value placed on those who were victims. If you had the power to produce terror, then that was all the justification that you needed. Might was right, and sex was not seen as a consensual act, but as an exercise of power. Powerful women, such as Queen Semiramis of Assyria, had the power to take away the procreative capacity of the eunuchs that she surrounded herself with. She had control of the men beneath her. And powerful men would have their way with the women who were of lower status than them. Historian Kyle Harper shows how the radical early Christian concepts of human freedom and liberty confronted and collided with the values which underpin ancient practices of slavery and ancient cultural assumptions regarding the appropriateness of sexual coercion. Historian Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, shows how Christianity challenged, undermined, and ultimately transformed the morality of marriage and sex that dominated these ancient societies. A morality that is hard for us to conceive of or relate to today. And Holland shows how these Christian values were not otherwise present in the ancient world in any cultural context. Holland writes, "The bonds of a Christian marriage, mutual and indissoluble as they were, served to join man and woman together as they had never been joined before." It was consent, not coercion, that constituted the only proper foundation of marriage. The Church, by pledging itself to this conviction and by putting it into law, was treading on the toes of patriarchs everywhere. Here was a development, pregnant with its implications for the future. Opening up before the Christian people was the path to a radically new conception of marriage. One founded on mutual attraction, one founded on love. In this new Christian understanding, the foundation of marriage was freedom and love. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on freedom, liberty, and consent. And I hope you will join us next time as we explore the reality of science.